Mr. Commissioner, this morning we're reconvening with the first commercial fishers panel, and Mr. Eidsvik is continuing his questions. I have received estimates and asked Council to be as quick as they can with their questions in order to ensure that we complete this, although, and I'll be perhaps reminding them from time to time where they're at vis-a-vis their estimate. There's a small point that Mr. Rosenblum drew to my attention. Mr. McEachern, one of the panelists, had corrections with respect to the transcript from some of his evidence from the last attendance. I'll plan to address those quick points during my re-examination at the conclusion of other questions. Mr. Eidsvik.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. For the record, Philip Eidsvik for the Area Gill Netters and the BC Fisheries Survival Coalition. Mr. Brown, if you look through the history of the fishery, and you're quite familiar with it given the book you've written and all the years you were on the commission, if you look through the history of the fishery from the 60s to the 90s, how would you describe that period?
I would describe it as a period following the Second World War as a period of gradual and slow rebuilding of stocks, particularly after the advent of the IPSFC in the 1930s and the rehabilitation work they did, and the gradual development of a whole industry and an entire sort of coastal network of dependency upon that fishery that evolved into the modern era in the 60s, was then subsequently shaped somewhat by the licensing programs brought in under the Davis Plan and limited entry, to culminating into the 80s and the 90s, where we saw stocks nearly rebuilt, Fraser River stocks nearly rebuilt to historic levels. And from there on, after the mid-90s, for a variety of reasons, we see this precipitous decline in productivity and a period of unprecedented political and social chaos.
Going to the period that ended in 1990, from the 60s to 1990, was there a general conception in the industry and in other places that we were doing a pretty good job of managing the rebuilding of the resource then?
Well, Mr. Commissioner, I'm not sure how I could quite answer that, other than I would think that there was a general feeling in the industry that things were not perfect, but that they were reasonably well managed. Stocks were rebuilding on the aggregate. There were always stocks of concern, but there seemed to be a growing sophistication within the fisheries management community around how one would go about identifying problems and addressing them. And I would say, despite the vilification by some quarters in the media and elsewhere, most commercial fishermen were deeply imbued with a conservation ethic. They understood that in order to survive as an industry, you had to buy into conservation and rebuilding. So I think, generally speaking, without overplaying it, there was a sense that we're doing okay here. And comparatively speaking to world fishery problems, which I don't purport to be an expert, but you read about them around the globe, where there's real calamitous and very, very conflict-ridden types of things going on. The Fraser River fishery seemed to be well managed, well studied, well thought through from a process point of view, and I think the fishing communities of all types were fairly comfortable within that.
And I'm going to just go off on a side distraction just for 1 second. It's often commercial people, the four of you sitting there, are looked upon as the rapists of the resource and not an environmental bone in your body. Can you tell us who fought the Moran Dam in the 1960s, long before the first environmental group got formed in BC?
Well, Mr. Commissioner, I was a former member of the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union, and at a fairly young age, I was deeply impressed by some of the figures that I met within that union. But it wasn't just limited to the union. There were people outside of the union that were very similar, but there were people like Homer Stevens, former president of the UFAW, a rank-and-file activist by the name of Scotty Nish, who put his life on hold for many years back in the 1950s, campaigning along with members of the BC Wildlife Federation and other citizens groups long before environmental groups were even thought of, to campaign against things like the Moran Dam, which had been a proposal of the provincial government of the day to dam the river upstream of Hell's Gate, and would have had a terrific amount of damage on all of our sockeye runs. So I think the point, Mr. Eidsvik, that you're leading me to is that working class people in the fishery had a deep commitment to the idea of protecting the resource and fighting for the resource and evolving environmental consciousness about the resource. And I guess, without trying to be too provocative here, in the more latter context, it seems that some of the discourse is very negative towards commercial fishermen, and yet none of my colleagues here, nor anybody that I met in my entire career in this fishery, ever callously thought, well, I'll go out and fish the last fish out. It's quite the opposite.
Every career, and you've had a long one, you make people, no matter how good intentioned, make major mistakes. And the union was an advocate for transferring a lot of the power by the International Pacific Salmon Fisheries Commission and a lot of their duties to the Department of Fisheries. Looking back now, was that a mistake?
Mr. Commissioner, this is kind of a difficult question. Again, I draw upon my background as a unionist and a Canadian nationalist, which I'm not ashamed of. When I was a younger person in the industry, I would listen to people like Jack Nickel, former president of the union, and Homer Stevens, and a number of other pretty powerful speakers go on about the need to get a salmon treaty in which Canada controlled the Fraser River and controlled all of its stocks. And without taking up too much of your precious time, this was an ongoing, century-long problem I tried to count in my book with U.S. interceptions of Canadian salmon. It totaled in the millions each year. It was a serious problem for the longest time. And so we always believed, I was brought up on the belief that once Canada got a salmon interception treaty for the entire coast, we would be all the better off. We also believed at the same time, it was a parallel process, that once we got a 200-mile economic zone off the shore of Canada, things would start to be better for working people in the fishery. I still believe the principles were correct. However, there are some things that happened subsequently to the signing of the Canada-US Treaty that have sort of diminished some of my enthusiasm. The first thing being that whatever else there may have been wrong with the old IPSFC format, and as you heard Mr. Lapointe describe it, this was a sharing arrangement in the Panel area waters, which is the lower Georgia Strait, Juan de Fuca, the Fraser River, where Canada and the United States shared 50-50 pink salmon and sockeye salmon going to the Fraser River. Whatever might have been wrong with that system, it had one very, very important factor that I think was very useful and enduringly valuable. That was that neither country could control the resource without some accountability to the others. This irked me as a Canadian nationalist, but looking back on it, there was a balancing or a checks and balances to that system that actually had a great deal of merit. I'm not suggesting we would necessarily go back to it, but what has bothered me subsequently is that once the Salmon Interception Treaty was put in place and all of the issues of so-called regulating the interceptions was in place, it was believed that Canada then would be able to unilaterally do whatever it wished with those stocks, and one of the things was, we've heard about it, which was the escapement add-on principle, that we would put more fish on the grounds so that there would be more fish to be caught by Canadian fisheries in the future. But that also brought about a new regime wherein new policies, new directives, largely from Ottawa, as to who would get the fish and who would get those benefits became highly politicized and highly problematic. I'm sorry, I hope I haven't gone on too long here, but all I'm trying to say is back in the earlier days, it was a narrower framework. It was a 50-50 sharing arrangement. There was much less room for discretion or political direction. And now, in my opinion at least, there's a good deal more politicization in terms of how the resource is used.
And that's an interesting period for, I think, the Commission. Things were going pretty good until about 1990, and to me we could probably find a lot of the answers of what's happened to the Fraser fishery if we look at the things that have changed since 1990. Now, we've seen in 1985, we had the new commission take over a lot of the, or DFO take over a lot of the duties that were formerly done by the commission. Is that correct?
Yes.
What other major changes happened about 1990 that you think may have led to the collapse of the fishery today, in the last 15 years?
Well, it's enormously complicated, Mr. Eidsvik, Mr. Commissioner. One of the things that changed, obviously, was the Sparrow decision, which in a way didn't change anything, but it certainly changed the way things were perceived. All along in all my career, it was always noted that Aboriginal people had a special right to fish. And all through my career, whenever we met with DFO personnel, we were always told, and nobody ever disputed it, that they had a priority for their food, social, and ceremonial fishery. After the Sparrow case, and I'm no expert in all of this jurisprudence, the entire way in which DFO seemed to operate around the Aboriginal fishery seemed to change dramatically. And if I'm asked, I could go into that in more detail, but I'm mindful of keeping brief here. I want to go to some of the other points. In my research for my book, I was forced over several years to go back into some pretty deep reading in terms of some of the antecedents to some of the restructuring that occurred following the 1983 Royal Commission done by Dr. Peter Pearce, which took the fishery from the from the 1970s era and projected it into the future as we know it now. And there was profound amount of transformation, but at the heart of a lot of that was a government objective that was articulated first in a document in 1978 commissioned by Pierre Trudeau. It was a document called Reforming Regulations, and in it Trudeau asked the Economic Council of Canada to answer two questions. How do we approach the new economy, and what will be the role of government in it? And there was an entire chapter in that report, written incidentally by Peter Pearce, who was on the commission, that essentially said that what the government needs to do is rationalize the fishery based on the notion of too many fishermen chasing too few fish, tragedy of the commons, et cetera, get it down so that it can be economically more viable, so they said, and the chief objective to derive economic benefit for the government of Canada in the form of economic rent, i.e. royalties or landage. So there was a whole thrust to reform the fishery in terms of making it more manageable, but also for the government to receive rent for the fishery. So, and I'm only half finished, but I see you're nodding or
I'm just
wanting to move along.
Sorry, Mr. Brown, I'm just trying to, I know we've got limited time, so I'm trying to focus on, if we go, we know that things were going okay till about 1990, things went off the rails. So we've seen two factors so far. You've identified the change from the IPFSC into the new commission and the transfer of a lot of duties over to DFO. We've talked about Sparrow and the issues that arose of that. If you had to look at any other prime factor, would there be one that you could think of?
All I can say is that I believe that, looking back over time, that there has been an overly fixated focus on the notion that the commercial fishery was the cause of all our problems here. I'm not going to sit up here and say that there weren't problems with the commercial fishery, but I will say, looking back, that there were many other factors impacting these salmon besides commercial fishing, which I do not believe a case can be made for overfishing in any significant way. And that most of the attention and most of the activity by the DFO over the last 10 or 15 years has focused on changing the commercial fishery as though it were the sole cause, and not addressing many of the other problems that other people that have testified here have identified as the problems. That is downsizing of government, the onslaught against fisheries habitat, all of the lack of knowledge and information that we need to properly protect these fish. And I could go on and on and on. My point being that it appears that the thing that the UFO focused on the most was the commercial fishery, which I think was overkill and unfair and far too selective. But I also note it was the one thing that was the easiest for the DFO to do.
So if we look at the 2009 fishery, for example, I brought Mr. Grout back to the 2005 fishery. Out of a run that was roughly 7 million, the commercial sector caught 129,000. So it's easy to see that the commercial sector had nothing at all to do with the collapse in 2009, given their fishing effort in 2005. Would you make that as a conclusion?
Absolutely.
Mr.
And
McEachern, I see you nodding your head. Would you make that as a conclusion as well?
Yeah, that's correct.
In 2007 and 2008, you'd have to go back and look at the brood years, and if those years were closed for commercial fishing, it would be easy to say commercial fishing is not a factor.
I do not believe commercial fishing was a factor in any of those years.
So the focus on management of the commercial sector, such as IQs, such as coho boxes, such as fleet downsizing, is misguided in the sense that it's a distraction from getting at the real problems. And I'm not saying that there's not commercial sector problems like with coho.
I think that the debate about how fishing rights within the commercial system should be developed, particularly around the notion of permanent property rights, is utterly outside of the real concerns we have for the fish themselves. There are a bunch of extravagant claims, in my opinion, about how this is the only way in which the fishery can be properly managed. I heard Mr. Grout make that point. I've heard it in 1,000 times from all kinds of people. I believe it comes from a very narrow philosophical premise that the only way human beings will do the right thing is out of crass, narrow economic self-interest. I personally, being a socialist, person coming from the left, quite proud of that, believes that human beings are more cooperative in nature than that. I believe that people left to their own devices to organize cooperative arrangements with proper knowledge and proper opportunity will do the right thing. And to that degree, Mr. Eidsvik, I would suggest that there are ways to make this fishery more responsible, more responsive to conservation, without having to enter into this whole discourse about property rights and all the other things. I don't want to go over all what I did the other day, Mr. Commissioner. There are other options that don't imply such a profound shift in property rights in order to control the fishery in exceptional circumstances of low abundance. But other than that, I don't see why we would go down that road.
What I'm asking you in really short terms is if the commissioner left here with the belief that IQs would solve the problem, IQs in the public commercial fishery, and he thought, okay, my job is over, I've recommended IQs in the public fishery, that his job would be done and the fishery would magically rebuild. Is that a pretty false and inaccurate conclusion?
I don't think there's any point in me repeating myself.
Thank you. I want to go to Mr. Sakic on consultation issues for a minute. You've been involved in the CSAB and in the IPSC, I guess it's called, the bigger group that...
Integrated Harvest Management
Integrated Harvest Management Committee. Other than license fee relief and funding for the CSAB for holding meetings in the Secretariat, is there any other decision that was made by consensus, the consensus approved at the IHPC? I see you puzzled, Mr. Atchin. Are you familiar with that issue?
I would like to know what you're looking for. There's a lot of things happen in there.
Was there a consensus decision on other issues aside from these two main points in the IHPC? Beyond a license holiday for the CSAB and a Secretariat, there's two items of consensus. Was there others?
This is just recent stuff?
Yeah.
I haven't been hanging around this process that much, and so...
Maybe Mr. Ashton can answer this
This
question.
would be something recent from here?
No, I think I'm going to switch. I think Mr. Ashton might know the answer to this question.
Well, I don't know that I know the answer beyond, I can't recall any other issues that were put up as a motion that received consensus beyond those two that you mentioned.
And that's a fairly big process, I gather. There's Aboriginal groups, commercial groups, sport groups, environmental groups in that process.
That's correct.
So a tough place to get consensus.
Oh, I think there's a diverse opinion amongst the participants.
Now, Mr. Sakic, you're a strong advocate of IQs in the fishery. Can I ask you, did the CSAB ever send a letter promoting, saying that the fleet had accepted IQs to the minister? That was
Not to my knowledge.
never sent out a letter that at a subsequent meeting, other people insisted that the letter be retracted and you had to write a second letter?
I would have to have a look through things. I have the records since the place started, and there's a lot of traffic has gone through, a lot of letters. We did have an executive director, but I have managed to keep everything together, but I don't recall anything like that.
Did the CSAB ever send out a letter opposing a judicial inquiry into the management of the fishery?
No, I don't think we sent out a letter opposing that.
Did the CSAB ever send it out, a letter without the CSAB approval as a whole, opposing the inquiry?
I don't think so, not that I remember.
And what's your position on this inquiry as a useful force?
Well,
I'm almost done,
I
Mr.
don't
Martin.
want to be standing to indicate any concern about the witness's answer per se. I just raised as a question this, and I think I've been attempting to give Mr. Eidsvik some leeway because he has some important points to identify through these witnesses. We've called these witnesses, as you'll recall, on allocation and management of the commercial fishery in the context of our hearings on this topic. I don't. Perhaps he can articulate the relevance of having witnesses opine on the terms of reference, or perhaps a more useful way of approaching that is to tie it to a particular issue.
Thank you, Mr. Martland. Mr. Commissioner, I'm simply addressing the consultation issue that goes on in our industry, and I gather consultation was one of the things that we were asked about, and I'm asking about a couple of the issues that were brought up in the context of our consultation process.
I want to answer that question. It's something I've been waiting to do in here. I don't have anything against the inquiry, as you asked me, but the one thing that is of great concern to me is that this is now going to be extended another year. So basically, this thing will have been in place for, 3 years? And if this is going to have any effect on other work that needs to be done, if everything goes on hold because of this inquiry, that becomes a real concern of mine. If we have to wait for outcomes to come out of here before we can move ahead with some things, that, again, is a concern of mine. That's my opinion. I'm allowed that one.
I think you're fully free and welcome to have all the opinions you want, Mr. Sakich. My point is, so you were content with the way things were managed and being going along? Did the CSAB have an opinion on this?
Okay, to explain that to you, the CSAB is a very diverse group of people, as you know. For the CSAB to come up with an opinion on an inquiry is a very hard thing to do because you would never reach consensus on it. So folks were left up to their own thoughts on it. Nobody said no, nobody said yes, we just left it alone, and you can go off to your other respective groups and you can support it from there. But to answer for a group where everybody thinks, every second person in there thinks different, would not be a very smart thing to do.
Okay. So given that lack of consensus, you're telling the commissioners today that no letter was sent by the CSAB opposing the judicial inquiry into the management of Fraser River sockeye because there was no consensus on it. That's your testimony today?
That is true.
Those are the end of my questions.
Now,
Mr.
one
Commissioner.
other,
Thank you.
just wait a minute here. There is one other thing here. Things are long ago and far away, but I do not recall any letter distinctly relating to being against this.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Those are my questions.
Mr. Eidsvik was at or under his allocation, and I appreciate that. Mr. Timberg is next.
It's Mr. Timberg for Canada with my colleague Geneva Grande McNeil. And Mr. Registrar, if we could have tab 7 from Canada's documents. And Mr. McEachern, I have some questions for you with respect to this email. Can you identify this email? It looks like you sent it on June 8th, 2008.
Definitely looks like mine. I wrote a lot of emails. It would take me a while to remember exactly what this is about, but it definitely looks like my writing, my typing.
All right, thank you. If this could be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 487.
And Mr. McEachern, it looks like you sent this email to all of the Area D Gillnet members on June the 4th, 2008, and it appears that you're answering a number of questions related to what I think is an application for a demonstration fishery for share-based management. Is that refresh your memory?
Yes, the email on the bottom part of the screen was, I guess you guys have eliminated the two portion, or it wasn't included, and then it looks like I forwarded it to the department to further some of the discussion I was having at the Harvest Committee level with the department.
All right. And did you send this out to the Area D GillNet members?
Yes.
All right. And who are the Area D GillNet members?
There's the Area D GillNet Association is a society, a nonprofit that's set up to advocate and lobby for Area D GillNet fishermen. We were in place before the current system of consultation with the area harvest committees was imposed upon us. So we see ourselves as the true voice of the Area D GillNet Association. So you've got, I think we have around 2/3 of the Area D fishermen belong to the association.
All right. And so point number one here, it looks like you're commenting on the results of a survey be in support or against the share-based management, this demonstration fishery. Is that correct?
Yeah, and point number one in particular was dealing with the issue we have around, there's two different types of Area D licenses. Ones are held by the general public and other are held by the Northern Native Co-op. And that goes into a little bit of detail around that issue.
Right. And it sounds like had the Northern Native Co-op voted against share-based management proposal, is that correct?
That's correct.
And but had they voted in favor of it, then you would have had your majority to have implemented this demonstration fishery?
That's correct. Of the fishermen that voted, yes.
Right. And do you know if the position of the Northern Native Co-op is still against share-based management, or is their position still, has their position changed since 2008?
We have had no discussion around that issue.
All right. And then over the page, then page 2 of 3 to point 3. And so you've written this email to sort of to share your thoughts about the debate on share-based management with your members, right? The pros and the cons. Is that generally what you were trying to do here?
Yeah, I think it would be fair to say I hadn't written this email with the intention of analyzing it in this setting.
Fair enough. So paragraph 3 then, in the middle line you say, I think that the trawlers were trying to structure their fisheries to catch fish at a speed that enables them to maximize quality, which is really the trawler niche. Could you elaborate what you mean by that statement?
Troll fish generally frozen at sea in a lot of cases is dedicated for a higher quality market, so they tend to like to catch their fish slower. Often they'll bleed their fish and then they dress it on board the vessel and freeze it. So they're looking to get paid for all that work, so they can't sell their fish at the same price that the net fleet sells their fish at, which is generally sold to a processor, and then those costs are added later. So they like to catch fish a lot slower, and then when there's a large volume of fish to catch, then the net fleet really starts to shine, and you can outfish the trawlers, in which case they would look to transfer fish off of their vessels so they can continue their slow pace.
Right.
Because trawlers can catch fish faster too, but they don't like to. They like to do it slower.
Right. And can you describe, for the benefit of of all of us, the difference between where a trawler then would catch one of their fish to get a higher quality return as compared to, say, a seine fishery where they would sell their fish, just so we can understand a bit of the business and the market behind the sales?
Well, the seine fishery, most of that, the vast majority of that fish gets sold to fish companies where it gets processed on shore. So, and it's destined for the more general use market. And so if you were looking for top quality sushi grade fish with very little bruising or marring, each fish is handled individually, you would look for more of a troll fish. But there are specialty operators in both seine and gillnet fisheries which also specialize in quality, but just as a whole, the seine fishery generally goes for volume.
So where would a troll fisher sell their product at the end of a a fishing
Well,
period?
there's some buyers that specialize in troll fish, so they would be buying off trollers, and a lot of the trollers, also independent operators, sell directly into restaurants and hotels.
And what's the difference in return that you get? What's the added value? Do you have a sense of that?
I'm not a troll fisherman or a seine fisherman, but my instinct was to be anywhere from 50% to twice as much per pound.
Okay, thank you. And paragraph 4, you talk about scrutiny on catch numbers and data for all sectors. And can you explain the importance of this increased scrutiny on the catch data?
Sorry, can you rephrase the question?
Yes. Can you explain for us what the view is, your views, with respect to increased scrutiny on catch numbers and data, and the relevance of improving that system?
I guess there's been a lot of finger pointing around data and who's catching what lately, especially in the period of time since since the mid '90s. And part of the frustration as a commercial fisherman is I'm very honest with my numbers. We have a very strenuous system of filling out logbooks and keeping track of our catch. So to hear ourselves as a fleet being accused of having poor catch numbers or cheating or lying is frustrating. And when I go to a lot of these meetings, we get looked down on because of our catch numbers not being accurate enough. So I think what I was getting at is, in this paragraph, is we need a way to try and increase the public confidence in our numbers. Especially when I go to a meeting where a lot of these newer fisheries we're having to fish around subscribe to a more strenuous dockside monitoring, which we don't have in our fishery. And the reality is we don't need it for accuracy's sake, but we might need it for public perception's sake. That's what I was getting at.
Okay, thank you. And if we could turn to paragraph 8 on page 3. You have a comment about under an ITQ system, there's less boats moving out to the grounds. And would you agree that under a share-based management, it provides an ability for the fleet to adjust itself to determine which boats should go out fishing and which not, depending on the total allowable catch?
Yeah, that is the major benefit, yes.
And can you comment on the cost of gasoline to operate a boat? I understand it's can be a very high cost in the commercial fishery, and I'd just like to hear your opinion on the cost of running a boat.
Sure. So most of the commercial vessels are actually diesel, but the analogy is the same. The cost of running a vessel is gone up astronomically in my generation, yes.
And what's the impact of that?
Well, every other industry that's affected by fuel prices is able to, a lot of industries are able to pass their costs on. For instance, if you were trucking potatoes from Idaho up to Los Angeles and the cost of fuel went up, you just increase the cost of trucking. Whereas the commercial fishermen, all of the input costs go into the fish product, and then the fisherman ends up with whatever's left over at the end. So there's really no way in passing on the cost of increased fuel onto the price of your fish. One of the ways we've been trying to think of how to deal with that would be to if there was a way, number one, to catch your fish with less boats and you save fuel, or if you could somehow have more independent control over your fish that you catch when you catch them, and maybe you could slow down your fuel burn that way. For instance, if you didn't have to rush to an area that was farther away, but you could catch them closer to your home port because you knew they'd be coming by at a later date, then that would save fuel.
Right, and pooling of licenses may also assist that reduction of cost.
Right, that's just another. Pooling and I2Q are both just ways of trying to get more fish on less boats.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Am I permitted to make a comment?
I only have a few minutes if I could
Well,
direct
it'll be
my
very
questions.
brief. I don't disagree with what Mr. McEachern's saying, but I would want to emphasize and reiterate, or at least be given the opportunity to say that you can do all of these things regarding fuel cost efficiency measures, et cetera, without ITQs. There are other options. I just don't
Thank you.
want to leave it as though that was the only way you can go about saving fuel costs, et cetera.
Thank you. I note that you attached at paragraph 9 to this affidavit a copy of a document called Sustaining America's Fisheries and Fishing Communities, which has been entered already at Exhibit 481. If Mr. Registrar, we could have Exhibit 481, please. And you encourage your members to read this document. So is it your view that this document is helpful in setting out some of the issues with respect to the debate?
Yes.
Thank you. And then if we could turn to Exhibit 14, tab 14, please, in Canada's binder. And Mr. McEachern, this is a letter from DFO, attention Ryan McEachern and the Area D Harvest Committee, sent February 18th, 2010, with respect to commercial demonstration fishery proposal. Have you seen this letter before?
Yes.
And if we could have that marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 488.
And can you clarify whether the Area D Gillnet Association did submit a proposal for a demonstration share-based fishery in 2010?
On Fraser River Sockeye?
Yes.
No.
Okay. And can you describe the discussions around why that did not take place?
The department made it clear that we would have to have another survey of our license holders.
Right.
And at the time, I asked for clarification of how we were going to treat the Northern Native co-op licenses,
Right.
which are substantially different than ours. I could go into detail on that, but it's probably not important. And without hearing any direction from the department about what would be viewed as a clear majority of fishermen, and without hearing any direction as to how we were going to deal with the Northern Native licenses, I decided that a further survey of my fleet would only cause more tearing apart of our group, which has managed to stay very friendly and able to work together through a lot of these issues, even though we have a strong support and strong opposition to ITQs within our fleet, and then there is a large group of people who are fairly neutral.
All right. And so just looking at this letter at the bottom of this page, DFO offered to assist with the survey of your group, but you decided not to pursue that for the reasons you just gave.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. And I have some general questions with respect to changes in the market conditions for the commercial fishers. So I'm open to some views from the panel with respect to some of these questions. Would you agree that there's been increased competition worldwide for sockeye salmon in the last 20 years? Is that a general statement that you can agree with? There's been increased competition from Chile, Norway, Alaska, and Russia. Mr. Sakich?
I don't know if you have any sockeye coming out of Chile, but you have an awful lot of them coming out of Alaska, Bristol Bay and those areas, and they can flood the market pretty good before we even get there. They're earlier time than our coast.
Oh, I see, because they catch their fish sooner in the season.
Yes, and I don't know what's going on over towards Russia, but there's issues with large pink catches too in southeast Alaska and over towards the Russian side now as well.
All right.
We had, a few years ago, at one of the Fraser panel meetings or just the general PST meeting, not a Fraser panel, open one, it was showing with the changes in the climate, how they were starting to get pinks and other types of salmon up into some of these areas in big numbers where they have not been for a gazillion years. So some of that's being harvested.
All right. And I'd like your view, Mr. Sakic, on the importance of the MSC process, the Marine Stewardship Council process. Is that important for the ability of the commercial fishers to sell their fish?
You're talking about the MSC Marine Stewardship certification?
Yes, thank you.
I think it is very important. I don't think you can get any fish out of this country without it now, can you?
And I'd just like your views then on why it's important. If you could just elaborate on why it's important.
Well, it meets a criteria of sustainability. There's a lot of hoops you've got to jump through to get that, and you basically. I don't think you're going to achieve that without full accountability for your fisheries. And there's a whole bunch of things in that. We could go on for an hour about that.
Right.
That'd be everything from monitoring to meeting stock assessments, criterias, and on it would go. It has to be a sustainable fishery to meet that MSC.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Sakic.
Mr. Timberg, are you moving off of the point of...
Yes, I am.
I had my hand up and I thought you had acknowledged, but maybe you don't want to hear but I did hear you say you wanted the panel as a whole to address this topic. Am I able to speak, or?
If you can limit your
Why is it that I have to limit? I'm just asking you. May I speak? I'll try to be brief.
Okay, if you could be brief, please. Thank you.
There is changes in the world salmon market. There is no question about that. But I don't draw the same inference, which you seem to do, is that because salmon markets are changing, we have to completely and utterly disrupt the entire historical foundation of the commercial fishery in British Columbia with all of its social benefits and all that it did to support coastal communities, i.e. where you were driving at in your leading questions a moment ago about ITQs, etc. I would say that one of the big things that we have, Mr. Commissioner, in our favor in Canada is Canada has a comparative advantage in that we have a highly regarded product image around the world. Canadian salmon, and particularly Canadian labels, are considered the top of the mark. We are closer, in some cases, to markets than some of our so-called competitors. Mr. Sakic talked about Alaska, and there are vast volumes of fish coming out of Alaska, but at very, very inferior product levels and at very, very high cost, comparatively speaking, to ours. It takes about 10 days for a packer to run from Bristol Bay, which is practically up near the Arctic, to processing plants, because they don't have the capacity in Bristol Bay, and a lot of it's processed in Prince Rupert. That's an added cost. It's a loss in quality. The case I'm making is that Canadian salmon can be very competitive, are very highly regarded, but I would argue that because of some of the politics in the industry over the last many decades, which includes also the undermining of former collective bargaining processes that once occurred in the industry and the ability of people in the industry to share some of the wealth that's been created by this resource, have been disrupted. And I would also argue that the prime way in which you can keep competitive in the world salmon market is by keeping the product in the market, by having shelf space for your product, by having the ability for the consumer to recognize it and see it. When you come along and do what has been done to the fishery over the last several years, and you have some years where, for example, in 2010, you had 38 million fish return, and only less than 30% are harvested, you diminish the supply, and you undermine your ability to maintain your market share. You're looking impatient at me, Mr. Timberg, but I think these are important points that need to be made.
I appreciate your comments, Mr. Brown. I do have a limited period of time this morning for my questions, and I have a number of things to cover, so I'd like to move on, if that's so.
Well, okay, I'll defer to you, but there's
Thank you.
many other points that I could make, and I think they should at some point be made.
And we're all
rather
working
than
on-
leaving the impression that the only way you can become competitive is through an ITQ system.
Thank
I don't
you.
agree with that.
Mr. Sakic, you are the co-chair of the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board, is that correct?
That's right.
And we've heard some concerns about the difficulty of reaching consensus and the difficulty of decision-making at the CSAB. I'd be interested in your views on how you would improve the CSAB decision-making.
Well, consensus is very hard to work with. I would think that if the folks that are elected in this country to run the country are setting the example, they're not doing it by consensus. I don't think that would work. And I expect it to work for us, and it's extremely hard to work. And I don't say that it's all that bad of a thing. A little bit of both somehow might be a good thing, but we went through an exercise of with professionals, what would be blocking, what wouldn't be blocking when you come to achieve consensus, and it gets very complicated.
Right.
It's very time consuming. I guess if you're on the payroll and you can sit there and you can argue about this for a whole year to make one point, fine, but we're not.
Right. And does the CSAB, would that organization like to have decision-making authority? Is that something you're seeking?
That's a difficult question. I mean, decision making on what? There's so many things that are coming through there, and sometimes I think that may be a question of things too. What should it be dealing with, and what shouldn't it be dealing with?
Right.
You know, every day it's something new. It's just like a minefield. Somebody wants something else. So probably in some cases the safest to do is not anything sometimes, because you just can't fulfill what everybody wants.
Do you have a scope of the subject that you think the CSAB could provide recommendations on? Do you have some topics that you think that the CSAB would
Well,
like
I think
to-
that's something, I wouldn't want to answer that, because I think that's something that the group would need to wrestle down with itself, just who's going to do what and how. And for me to, just as a non-engaging chair almost, to say what it should be would be not right.
All right. Thank you. And if we could move to tab 11 of Canada's documents, please. And Mr. Sakic, if we could, or Mr. Commissioner, if we could turn to, or Mr. Registrar, if we could turn to the second page. There's a forward. And this is a forward by yourself, Mr. Sakic, that you're the Monitoring and Compliance Panel Chair, is that correct?
That's right.
And can you identify this document for us? If perhaps we could go back to the front page, Mr. Registrar.
This was put together by the Monitoring and Compliance Panel over about a year and a half or so,
All right.
through many meetings.
All right. If this could be marked as the next exhibit, please.
It's already an exhibit.
Oh, it is.
It's
what-
exhibit number 428.
Thank you. So if you could, page 13 has a list of the summaries. If we could turn there. So, Mr. Sakic, can you help us by describing what the conclusion was to this report and the next steps?
We're still going, and since we have put this document out, Fisheries and Oceans have now put one very similar out.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of crossing in the two. You know, there are a lot of paralleling in the two documents. And I guess what our next move is going to be, we're going to try and pull together a meeting here fairly soon to address the cost effectiveness of monitoring. That's one of the issues with it, why it's a hard sell, because it's so expensive.
Right.
And we're going to try and work around that. And not everybody will be doing this exactly the same way. And so it's innovation, cost effectiveness, that's our next move on this now.
All right, thank you. Mr. Registrar, if we could have Exhibit 454. And Mr. Ashton, on when you were here last, you put in a series of documents with respect to the issue of knotless bunts. And if we could turn to the next page, please. And this is a letter you wrote to Mr. Gordon Curry on June 30th, 2004. At the bottom of the first paragraph, you concluded that the committee does not endorse or support the selectivity project in 2004. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And at the bottom, you believe that further expensive experiments are not necessary.
I believe it also says in there that we had met, and part of this program was that when enough information had been gathered through the various years of testing this equipment, that it would be subjected to a PSARC review. Right. And we had our directors look at the information, and they felt that there had been enough, and what was proposed for continuing that program in 2004, we didn't believe was going to add any significant new information that would change how the project would be viewed.
Okay, thank you.
PSARC review is, I guess they present a paper, and it's reviewed. It's a peer review process, and might add that our Harvest Committee made up of 12 members. 2 of them are processors, but the other 10 are fishermen, and we probably have about 400 years of knowledge in the fishing industry collectively together, and I think that would be regarded as a peer review of our own.
Okay, thank you. If we could turn to the next page, the letter July 5th, 2004. Then Mr. Curry wrote back to you, and at the start of the second paragraph, he states that he has witnessed a significant amount of acrimony towards Mr. Paul Brachik and DFO staff supporting this project over the past few years. You'd agree with that?
That would be Mr. Curry's opinion.
And I guess I'm asking you, would you agree with his opinion that there's a significant amount of acrimony with respect to the Grids and Knotless Bunt project?
I really couldn't comment on that. I've known Mr. Brysich for a long time. His father as well was a significant fisherman that was in the business when I started fishing over 40 years ago.
All right, thank you. If we could then turn to the next letter at July 11th, 2004. And at the end of the letter, the last paragraph, you conclude saying that you're looking forward to a comprehensive review of the project at a post-season meeting to assess whether the implementation of this equipment will afford the benefit of increased fishing access to the Area B fleet, correct? That's
correct.
Yeah. And so you were seeing this selective fishing technique as a way of increasing fishing access?
If it was deemed to be acceptable and viable and affordable, then we would look at it as something that could be adopted.
Okay, thank you.
It had to go to that review.
And if we could then, Mr. Registrar, I have one new series of documents that Mr. Curry provided over the weekend and we disclosed this morning. If that could be pulled up, it's an email from Gordon Curry to Chris Ashton on January 17th, 2005. And at the bottom of the page, if you could show the from and to line there, thank you. Yes, and so this is from Gordon Curry, and it's to Chris Q and yourself, Mr. Ashton. Did you?
Yes.
Okay. And attached to this email, there were 3 documents: a grid meeting agenda from December 4th, 2004, a grid study, and some grid notes of Mr. Bracek.
That's correct.
All right. If this document could be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Did you want that marked as one document?
I'll suggest that the first page be marked as the number, and then the next 3 will have letters.
Be
And-
marked as Exhibit 489 will be the email.
And then over the page,
Presentation notes will be 489A. The selective fishing meeting document will be 489B. And the selective grids will be 489C.
all right. And so there was a postseason review held on December 8th with respect to the grids and knotless bunts. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then 489A sets out some of the notes of the presenters. Is that correct?
I believe so. I haven't had a chance to read through all this, so.
All right. And then if we could go to 489B, minutes of the meeting on December the 8th. In attendance was yourself. And at the bottom it reads, it talks about the selective fishing policy. And it goes on in that paragraph to talk about the need for a review of the evolution of grids and knotless bunts. And if we could go to 489C, this then is the project summary. And have you seen this document before? This was provided to you at the meeting?
I haven't read the one that you have here, but I did attend that meeting and I would have had that material.
All right.
It's somewhat similar to the one that was presented in June, I think it was June 18th, 2004. I think it's quite similar. Let the smaller fish escape. It doesn't allow fish of different species of the same size escape, so that was one of the complicating factors.
All right. And then, Mr. Registrar, if we could move to my final document, which is dated February 1st, 2005. I'm not sure, Mr. Ashton, if you received this document. This is from Mr. Curry, and it summarizes the results to date with respect to the work on grids in combination with knotless bunts.
I don't recall. I may have received that, but I can't. That's quite a few years ago. I can't recall it.
All right. Would you agree that the results to date with respect to the benefit of knotless bunts in combination with knotless bunt web can do the following, that they can allow the escape from the bunt of a high percentage of immature salmon? Are you aware of that?
I'm aware of that. A lot of the testing that took place was out in Area 20, and by regulation, our nets or the bunt portion of the net is required to have a 100 millimeter 4-inch bunt, which allows a significant amount of juvenile fish to swim through those. That was after extensive research done over a number of years of testing different sizes, so that the grids let the fish through the large mesh bunt. The normal bunt that's used in all other areas in the salmon fishery is 70 millimeters, so it's quite a bit smaller.
Right. And so you'd agree with that comment?
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, it's quite obvious.
Okay. And if this document then perhaps could just be marked as the next exhibit.
Marked as Exhibit 490.
And those are all my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Mr. Commissioner, I'm grateful to Mr. Harrison for the Conservation Coalition, who took my request to heart and trimmed his questions down to 0. Mr. Harvey's next.
Chris Harvey for the Area G Harvest Committee and the UFAWU. First, some questions for Mr. McEachern. Just questions of detail relating to how ITQs, how fishing businesses are managed. Is it common for fishermen to operate their fishing businesses through a closely held company, such that usually the boat and the license is owned by the company?
You mean a personal company or a large company?
Yeah, a personal company.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. Quotas as well, I expect, are held in the same way. Is that right?
There's a pretty strong mixture, I think, between people who personally own their things solely and those who own them as a small company with their wife or kids or something like that.
Okay. Does DFO regulate the ownership of those companies?
I don't know.
You've never experienced DFO questioning who owns the shares of the company that owns the license? No. And ITQs are freely bought, sold, and leased, is that correct?
My experience is with herring ITQ. I don't have any experience with salmon, sorry.
Oh, all right. Oh, I see. Your family group of licenses, did you say, are held in the Area C, that's the Northern Gillnet, and the Area D, Southern Gillnet?
Actually, after area licensing, we had to buy licenses in all three areas. Area E as well.
C, D, and E. All right. And those are all non-ITQ areas. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's been
Yes,
no ITQ gillnet fisheries to date.
Yeah. When these votes occur on licenses, does your family vote all its licenses in the same way?
Well, when the votes come from the department, you get one vote per license.
Yes.
And so I'm not sure how other companies would handle that, but we generally sit down as a group and come up with an answer, and they are all voted the same way, yes.
Yes. Similar to the Northern Native Co-op.
Right. I'm not familiar with whether the fishermen of the Northern Native Co-op actually participate in the process, but our fishermen do.
Yeah. And to your knowledge, I expect CanFisco vote their licenses in the same way?
I have no idea, sorry.
All right. Mr. Sakic, you're an Area H trawler, is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. There are 89 trawl licenses in Area H, is that correct?
A couple less maybe now, but around there.
Yeah. And am I right in that about 50 to 60 actually participate while the others lease out their quota or have sold it to others?
I don't think there's any selling because I don't think you own anything. This is a pilot.
I see.
And it is rented, in some cases been given, and I would think the licenses on the vessels that aren't showing up, they're basically because they're involved in other offshore fisheries like tuna, things like that. They don't want to make the trip in.
Yeah. But they all have equal ITQ shares in this demonstration in Area H, is that correct?
That's right.
So they would lease out their ITQs to others?
Yeah, we have two pilots running there, just for your information, and they're not run at the same time. The particular one you're referring to is done by the Piece of Fish. We have a pilot up and running that is a time block quota as well that we use in the fall months on Chum, and that is where you're trading time, not actual fish.
Trading time in the sense of trading ITQs? Or?
That's right. Yeah,
That's
you're given so many days each to start with, and you have to assemble those days that work for you into a certain block. It's
Is this the way it operated in 2010, that your Area H was initially allotted 5% of the sockeye allocation?
No, that is by the piece. That is by the percentage of the catch.
in Area H, how was the ITQ allotted to, in Area H in 2010? How was it allotted?
Well, when there was an identified TAC early in the season,
Yes.
I think our first allotment was 250 fish per license, something like that.
Yes. Okay.
And they changed as the total allowable catch changed.
Yes. And am I right in thinking that the Area H trawlers were not able to catch their ITQs because the fishery closed?
Well, you're dealing with, well, they were not able to catch it, no, because you're dealing with such an anomaly of a year for the amount of fish that's thrown at you in such a short time.
Yes. Troll fishing is done at a rather slow pace, whether it's ITQ or under a TAC arrangement, is that right?
It could be, but it is a slower way to catch fish. But don't confuse one thing. When I went back to what I said a minute ago, that when there was a TAC identified, that our first identifiable catch for Area H was 250 fish per boat.
Yes.
That is a lot better than being thrown out there and in 5 days you see you catch what you want, then leave.
Yeah. But but in the sockeye fishery, when it turned up in large numbers, the Area H trawlers were unable to catch their TAC. That's correct, isn't it?
That's right.
And that would have been the same whether it was it was an ITQ fishery, but it would have been the same without if it was not an ITQ fishery, correct?
Well, you definitely wouldn't have caught your own, and the difference is the ones you didn't catch, if you could get somebody else in a seine boat to catch them for you, that was done because we have a B&H integrated fishery.
Yes, all right. But I guess the point is this, that the ITQs did not slow down the pace of trolling when the sockeye turned up in large numbers in 2010.
No, they didn't.
No, all right. Mr. Brown, I have some questions for you. The ITQ market that you've referred to in the leasing market for ITQs, is it basically an unregulated market?
Yes.
Yes. The ITQs essentially become financial assets gifted by DFO to the first generation of license holders?
That's exactly right.
Yes.
And I'd also add that there's nothing pertaining to those ITQs that obliges the owner of those ITQs to do anything in terms of paying rent or return, other than possible income tax, I suppose, to the real owners of the resource, which is the people of Canada.
The opportunity to fish is created by the license. Am I correct in that?
Yes?
What the ITQ adds to that, am I correct, is a free gift in perpetuity of a defined share of the common property fishery resource.
Yes, and that is fundamentally different than a limited entry license, as you point out. A limited entry license, which is an obviously necessary thing, we can't all go commercial fishing, the resource won't stand it, so we all agree that we have to have a socially acceptable way of determining who shall participate. But it doesn't confer anything other than the option to participate. So if you're a fisherman, you would then have to rely on your own competitive skill and knowledge and equipment, et cetera, but it doesn't give you any set amount. An ITQ is a fundamentally different approach. It gives you not only property and fish before they're even landed, but it gives it gives you the opportunity to treat that as property over an extended period of time, thus enhancing the speculative and marketable value. One in these days might not be too inclined to go and buy a limited entry salmon license given the upheaval in the industry and the poor prospects. So that has tended to keep speculation and inflation in fishing privileges somewhat low in these days. Earlier on, there was considerably more speculation, but that was the point I was trying to make in the last session about this burden of capitalization, which has now been imposed on this industry since primarily beginning in 1969, but expanding exponentially since 1990 with the introduction of all these different quota fisheries, which solves the problem for certain people in DFO, particularly people that sit in ivory towers and stare into computers and take a paycheck saying they're managing a fishery, as you've heard abundant testimony here. Solves their problem in that they can say, oh, we have less people to have to worry about out there, and so on and so on. It makes life easier for them. But I'm not the slightest bit interested in making life easier for DFO managers. I am interested in the fish, and I am interested in fish harvesters. And I think the ITQ system does very little to help them. And as I said last time, Mr. Commissioner, this capital burden is enormous and will stay with us over generations and will put perpetual pressure on the resource. That's even before we've gotten into ITQs on salmon. It will get worse when we do that. So I plead with everybody to consider that we do not go down that option and look at other alternatives.
In terms of regulation, it seems to me the ITQ shares, as you've described them, are essentially a tradable asset that is gifted by DFO to the first generation fishermen, correct?
Yes.
It's not unlike the shares in a company in the sense that they can be traded.
Yes.
Except with shares in a company, you've got stock market regulation. Have you got any similar regulation?
No, you do not have regulation, and if I may, I'd like to, Mr. Harvey, just also, and Mr. Commissioner, point to a secondary or tertiary problem in that the way in which DFO has approached the criteria for determining who will be eligible for ITQs in the various fisheries has been problematic, to say the least. Generally speaking, what has happened is a group of fishermen sit down with DFO, not necessarily in concert with all of the participants in the fishery, and they work out a system. It'll usually be based on some kind of landing performance over a set period of time. And those that are lucky enough or who qualify for that criteria are, as you say, Mr. Harvey, they're gifted with the quota. Those who, for whatever reason, don't are out. And that has been a concern of mine. I think that there has been politics around that, and there has been controversy over that. Also, I've been a little bit troubled when I hear only the voice, it seems to me, in a lot of the public pronouncements by DFO of the proponents of ITQs being those who are the ones who are in favor of this. And they cite the fact that there's overwhelming votes in some sectors. Let's be real here. When you give somebody the opportunity of an ITQ, you're giving them the opportunity to print money. So it's quite often that you'll see people operating in self-interest around this subject. But I don't look at it that way, and many of us in the industry don't, in the sense that we were put here and elected to be here to represent all the participants in the industry, and we have to articulate those who are less advantaged, have less access to capital, or may have been plain outright discriminated against in terms of the criteria for determining those quotas.
Yeah. Now, you say that the DFO and the license holders sit down and work it out. Is there any involvement of the fisheries dependent communities in this dialogue?
No. Fishing communities have long articulated their concerns, Mr. Commissioner, about this. And as I tried to say in my last session to you, when somebody sells a quota out of a small village like Sontula or Prince Rupert or Hartley Bay or Qualicum or any other place, it's more than just a personal transaction on the stock market or in the economy. It impacts those coastal communities profoundly, because when those jobs or those catches go, whole series of ancillary and tertiary industries and interests are hurt. So coastal communities, to best to my knowledge, have been arguing that if quotas are to be defined in the fishery, that there needs to be some perspective or some ability for communities to secure those quotas. And there's been quite a bit of work done on this, both on the West Coast and the East Coast, where there's, I think the principle, if I'm correct, is the adjacency principle, where there would be some notion that if a quota for salmon was being allocated in perpetuity, that somehow or other there'd be some attachment to the traditional fishing areas in close proximity where people had fished for a long time.
There are obviously enormous socioeconomic implications to an ITQ system being inaugurated in a fishery. Do you think the DFO fishery managers are equipped and competent to deal with those broad socioeconomic implications?
That's a tricky question because I think there are people in the DFO who are equipped. They are trained economists. I'm not so certain that all of their analysis comes to the light of day. I think that most of the people that do the talking about ITQs these days are people like Jeff Grout and others that you've heard. Sometimes it would be senior people like Paul Sprout. And what they focus on, almost to exclusion, is that it makes life easier for them, and so be it. They're very eloquent, and they make that case. Less boats means an easier time for these fish managers, presumably. However, I don't believe that those fish managers, most of whom are biologists, or some of them are just pure bureaucrats, have all that great of an insight into socioeconomic impacts. And that was my other point, building on what Dr. Walters had said in his testimony, that needs to be done here. We're dealing with very profound socioeconomic and political shifts here. And when they are codified as property, there's no going back. DFO can't say, oh, we're going to just test it out. They're kind of getting away with that now with all these fancy terms about pilots and all the rest. But once it goes through that doorway of property, there's no going back. And if DFO recognized that it made a mistake and something was wrong, if it tried to, it would be vulnerable to vast lawsuits and all kinds of complications. So I would go back to what Dr. Walters is saying, and I don't think I'm taking any liberty here. I heard him very clearly say that when you go down the road of these major changes, both in terms of the management of the resource, i.e. weak stock management, or into changes around fishing rights, you should be doing a full and transparent socioeconomic analysis, and that has not been done.
Mr. Commissioner, I note the time.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes. Mr. Harvey, please grab your mic. Thank you.